Hi. My name is David Morgan. I'm a police officer, and I've been serving for over 40 years. Few people know what we face on duty, not only criminals, but also other people's pain, loneliness, fear, and despair. Behind the uniform, an ordinary person with fatigue and memories. Sometimes it's enough just to knock on a door one more time to save someone's life. I decided that no one else would tell, from a first-person perspective, the details of the stories that happen every day in the world. This is one of the stories that left its mark on my life. I remember that shift too clearly. Sometimes years get erased, faces, dates, reports. But that night stayed with me. It was a late shift. Almost midnight. The station was living its usual tired life. The old air conditioner was humming. It smelled like coffee that had long stopped being energizing. I was sitting at the desk, sorting through papers, when the dispatcher raised her head and looked in my direction. A call came in. Neighbors. They say the man from apartment 4B hasn't come out for several days. The light is on. The smell is strange. He doesn't open the door. An ordinary welfare check. Such calls rarely end with something good. Either the person simply doesn't want to see anyone, or it is already too late. I took the car keys. My partner that night was busy at a traffic accident, so I had to go alone. Honestly, I didn't even attach importance to it. Just one more address. The building stood in an old neighborhood. 5 floors, concrete, peeling paint. The windows glowed with dim yellow light. The entrance met me with the smell of dampness and old linoleum. On the 3rd floor 2 neighbors were already waiting for me, a woman about 50 and a young man. "He is definitely home," the woman said. "The light doesn't go off. And it smells somehow." I approached the door of 4B. Silence. I knocked. "Police! Open the door!" Nothing. I put my ear to the door. At first, nothing. Then, it seemed as if something barely audible creaked inside. Or was the old building playing with me? I knocked harder. "Sir, if you hear me, open!" Silence. The smell really was there. Not sharp, but heavy. Not the kind you want to feel. I called for backup and permission to force entry. While I waited, my heart was beating too calmly. This is always a bad sign, when you are already internally ready for the worst. After 15 minutes the door was opened. The first thing I noticed, the light. It really was on. In the hallway, neat shoes, a jacket on the hanger. Everything looked as if the owner had simply stepped out for a minute. But the smell, it was from the depth of the apartment. I went inside. Kitchen clean. A cup on the table. Water in a glass. The clock was ticking. And then I heard a sound. Weak. Almost imperceptible. Not a creak. Not wind. It was breathing. I froze. The sound was coming from the bedroom. At such moments adrenaline does not shout, it tightens the chest from inside. I slowly walked down the corridor. The floor creaked under my feet. The bedroom door was slightly open. I pushed it. He was lying on the floor, between the bed and the nightstand. An elderly man. Thin. Pale. Eyes open. Looking at the ceiling. And breathing. Weakly. But breathing. "Sir, do you hear me?" His lips slightly trembled. I dropped to my knees beside him, checked his pulse. Weak, but there. On the nightstand, a knocked-over phone. Apparently, he tried to reach it. He had lain like that for several days. The neighbors thought the smell meant it was already over. I called an ambulance. While we waited, I spoke to him, although I was not sure he understood. "Hold on. We will not leave you." He barely noticeably blinked. And at that moment I understood, a little more, and it would have been too late. But that was only half of the story. Because when the medics were carrying him on the stretcher, I noticed something strange. On the wall, directly opposite the bed, hung a photograph. Old. In a frame. On it, a young police officer. Me. And I knew for sure, I had never been in this apartment before. When I saw that photograph, something inside me seemed to click. I came closer. An old picture. Black and white. I am in uniform, young, about 30. Standing near a patrol car. A smile that I long ago forgot how to wear. The caption below, in faded ink. Thank you for not passing by then. 1994. That year I remembered. Too well. The neighborhood was difficult. Many calls, much loneliness behind closed doors. I looked back at the man who was being carried out by the medics. The face emaciated, aged, but in his features there was something familiar. I could not remember. At the hospital they told me he survived by a miracle. Dehydration, weakness, a fall. Several days without help. If another day. The doctor did not finish. I nodded. We hear such phrases often, but rarely think about how thin the line is. I returned to the station closer to morning. But the photograph would not leave my head. I raised the archive. The same neighborhood. And then a memory surfaced. A call from neighbors. A young guy. Lives alone. Suspicion of depression. Locked himself inside. Does not answer. I was younger then, hotter. My partner wanted simply to make a report and leave. But something then stopped me. I insisted on forcing the door. The guy was sitting on the floor, his back against the bed. Nearby, pills. He did not shout. Did not resist. Just looked at one point. I then sat opposite him and said, "You are not obliged to cope alone." I do not know why I said it. It is not from a textbook. It is not protocol. He then cried. For the first time in, possibly, years. We took him to the hospital. Then therapy. Then he disappeared from my field of vision. And I never knew how it ended. Until that night. In the hospital he looked at me. "And you still came," he said hoarsely. I came closer. "We are obliged to come." He barely smiled. "No, you always come." I was silent. He looked at me for a long time, as if checking whether it was a dream. "Then, in '94, if you had not gone in, I would not have lived to this week." The words hung in the air. Sometimes in service you see blood, fights, tragedies. But rarely do you see continuation. And I stood in front of continuation. He told that later he began life anew. Worked, married. His wife died several years ago. There were no children. After her death he again closed himself off. Almost stopped going out. "I did not want to bother anyone," he said quietly. "When I fell, I thought that is how it should be." And here something inside me tightened. Not fear. Not guilt. But understanding. Sometimes people do not ask for help not because they do not want to live, but because they are afraid to be a burden. But the story did not end there. A week later they called me again. The same neighbors. The same address. And the dispatcher's voice was already different. He returned home. "But, again, something is wrong." And at that moment I understood. The hardest thing begins not when you save a person, but when he needs to learn to live further. When the dispatcher pronounced the address, something unpleasantly grew cold inside me. "The neighbors say he again does not open. The light is on. They heard a scream at night." I silently took the keys. This time I did not perceive it as an ordinary call. Too many coincidences. Too fresh was the memory of his pale face on the floor. The entrance met me with the same dampness. But now everything felt different, as if the walls were watching. The neighbor from the 4th floor looked alarmed. "He returned yesterday. The ambulance brought him. I offered to help, but he refused. And at night, I heard him talking. Loudly. And then, as if something fell." "With whom was he talking?" She shook her head. "He lives alone." I approached the door of 4B. I knocked. "It's me. Police." "Open." Silence. But this time there was no smell. There was silence. Too dense. I listened. And again, a barely perceptible sound. Not breathing. Whispering. I could not make out the words. I knocked harder. Sir, open the door. The lock clicked. The door slowly opened. He stood in the doorway. Pale. Sunken. Eyes red, as if he had not slept. You came again, he said quietly. The neighbors are worried. He smiled, strangely, tensely. People are always worried too late. I looked at him more carefully. The apartment was dark, only the desk lamp was on in the room. May I come in? He froze for a second, then stepped aside. I entered. The apartment looked different. Earlier it was neat. Now on the table lay open boxes of medicine. On the floor, papers. On the wall still hung the photograph. But next to it appeared another one. A woman. Young. Smiling. My wife, he said, noticing my gaze. She died 3 years ago. I nodded. The neighbors heard a scream. He lowered his eyes. I was talking to her. Silence. In such situations you cannot press sharply. But you also cannot pretend that nothing is happening. Sir, you understand that she could not answer you? He looked at me, and in his gaze there was no madness. There was despair. I know. But sometimes, if you speak out loud, it becomes quieter inside. These words struck stronger than I expected. I went into the room. On the table lay an old album. Open. On the last page, an empty space. And next to it, a pen. You were writing something? He sat on the edge of the sofa. I thought, if then you had not come, everything would have ended. And now, you came again. He raised his eyes. How many times does a person have the right to be saved? The question hung in the air. I have seen much over the years of service. Seen people who destroyed everything around them. And seen those who were simply tired of fighting. He was not dangerous to others. He was dangerous to himself. As many times as necessary, I answered. He quietly smirked. Even if he himself no longer believes? Then someone must believe for him. He covered his face with his hands. And for the first time in all our meetings I saw how a man of 70 years cries just like that young guy in 1994. Time does not heal loneliness. It only makes it quieter and deeper. I called the crisis service. Not as an arrest. Not as coercion. But as help. He did not resist. When the specialists were talking with him in the next room, I stood in the corridor and looked at that photograph from 1994. I then thought that I simply did my job. But sometimes work is not about the law. It is about hearing a whisper behind the door. And knocking one more time. Later that night I stepped out of the entrance. The air was cold. Quiet. The neighbor cautiously asked, Will he be all right? I looked at the windows of his apartment. The light went out. Today, yes, I answered. And I understood one thing. The thriller in our work is not always a criminal with a weapon. Sometimes it is silence in an apartment. Sometimes it is a person who is afraid to ask for help. Sometimes it is the moment when you decide to pass by or to stay a minute longer. And every time when someone calls and says, he does not come out of the apartment, it may be not just a call. It may be a second life.